Welcome to the Analog Gamers Podcast, a short podcast on board games and board gaming experiences. Here are your hosts.
I'm Shane.
And I'm Brent.
And I'm Frank.
Welcome back to our podcast today. Today we're going to talk about variable player powers. To define this up front, this is when in a game you have multiple players and each of those players can do something a little bit different than the other player. Sometimes for the benefit or the detriment of that player, but they are different characters or different things going on in the game. A good way to think about this is when you're reading a good book and there's multiple characters in a group. Each of those characters usually has a different role. I was just reading the Steelheart book the other day, and if no one's looked up, it's by Brandon Sanderson. It's a group of 6 characters. They're trying to take down an evil bad guy. But in it, you have a guy who's good at improvising, a hitman, a leader, and a tech person, for example. Each of those are good at different things and different roles throughout the book. And so, too, when they make a game out of it, which is on Kickstarter right now, they've incorporated that into the game. So we see this a lot in co-ops especially, because it doesn't matter whether the playing area is fair as much as that the theme or the game is fun. Shane, what's one of your favorite variable player power games?
So one of my favorites that we've played a lot, and we've played a lot with some of our students in youth group, is Forbidden Island. So Forbidden Island's it's a great little co-op, about 30 minute game. And in Forbidden Island, you take on different roles. So I think we've talked about this game before, but basically in Forbidden Island, there's just a bunch of location tiles laid out on the board in a random order, and you have to move your player around the board to collect different artifacts. You're collecting 4 different artifacts before the entire island sinks. And those tiles are going to be coming off the board as different parts of the island sink. And so different players have different roles within the game. So there's a diver who can actually swim through sunken areas. There's a pilot who can fly all over the board. And one of the things I really like about the kind of variable player power setup, man, that was tough to say. One of the things I really like about that is, when you come to a board, when you come to a game, everybody has different experiences and everybody has different experience levels with games. And so, in some ways, there's kind of already variety taking place with players at the game. And variable player powers really kind of gives each player a unique experience of the game, a unique role within the game. And especially in these co-ops that we're talking about in Forbidden Island, it really gives somebody a necessary role to play. Because I think we've all played a game where we're just kind of like, we feel like the 3rd or 5th wheel because we're not really doing anything in the game.
On the sidelines.
And we kind of feel like we're just being dragged along by everybody. But with variable player powers, it really gives you a unique experience, a unique role within the game. And I really like that. How about you, Frank?
So I would probably go with Pandemic, but Pandemic is by the same designer as Forbidden Island, and the difference is it's probably a little bit more thinky than Forbidden Island.
Yeah.
It's got instead of trying to get artifacts off of an island, you're trying to cure the world of 4 diseases before mankind is wiped out. So I guess the theme's a little more grim. But it's not just co-ops that you see this in. So you see this. I'm going to go back to Brent's original example. You could take Lord of the Rings, you could take Harry Potter, you could take a number of fantasy games that actually then try and reflect characters in the gameplay, whether it's competitive or cooperative, and then play it that way. Now, the one you've been playing lately, or that Lindsay got, was Harry Potter...
Hogwarts Battles.
There you go. And that is cooperative.
It is cooperative, and it has variable player powers in it.
But if you take something like Star Trek Fleet Captains, that has variable player powers in it because it's generally a 2 or 4 player game. You can play it with an expansion as a 3 or 6 player game. I'm not recommending that at all at 6 players. I'm not really recommending it at 4 players.
We need to try it again.
We do need to try it again because we figured out I had read some rules wrong. But the idea is one person's Klingon, one person's, in the base game, one person's Federation. What's interesting about that one is there aren't explicit powers that are defined up front. In that one, it has a drafting element that you do up front as part of the setup, and that then gives each of the players unique abilities because their decks are unique.
I was going to say that, so even from the start, the two different character sets are different. I mean, the Federation and the Klingon are very different, and their decks reflect that.
Yes.
And how they are, what they consist of. You're not going to have, even if the two people drafted, they can't draft the exact same.
Right.
You're not going to have the same
sets of
characters
cards
going on.
Yeah.
Yeah, so when you're talking about that, it made me think of Star Wars Risk and how there's, the two different factions in that game.
Right.
Would that be considered variable player powers? I'm specifically thinking about executing Order 66 because that's such a unique aspect of that game and only available to one of the players.
It is. So one of the things that Brent and I, before you showed up, Shane, but one of the things that we were kicking around was, we just started to when you came downstairs, was where's the line between variable player powers and just an asymmetric game, right?
Yeah.
So we hear about, probably the closest to that we hear about in the news that people might be familiar with is, we every once in a while talk about asymmetric wars, right? A big power like the United States going against an insurgent group, that's asymmetric. They're not going to fight with the same tactics. They're not going to fight the same way. They don't have the same tools available to them. Take that idea of mismatch and take it into the gaming area, and you have an asymmetric game. But exactly where the line is between asymmetry and variable player powers, or maybe it doesn't even matter.
Yeah.
Maybe they're just on the same continuum. I don't know.
So I think really the line probably falls with how thematic it is. In several war games, but not all, you end up with an asymmetry because that reflects more of real life or the scenario that you might be playing in a given battle. But then there's not as much theme to that. It's historically relevant potentially, and perhaps that has to do with the fact most war games are set at so small a scale. They're not set at a war, they're set at a battle or even a couple battles, but they're not of the large scale. You don't get as much theme out of the two sides.
So I have trouble thinking of war games as thematic because it's history.
The theme is history.
Right. So, I mean, assuming that it is not a sci-fi war game, something like that. If it's a historical war game, is it thematic when it's historical?
Well, it's history. We rewrite a lot then.
I think
It
so
is.
because it's. I mean, you're simulating, right? History would be you play out the battle exactly as it happened in history, but the reason the theme is that they kind of set you in the circumstance, and then you get to play within that historical circumstance. So you're not reenacting. It's not a reenactment.
That's true.
You're almost rewriting history on your table because you get to play out those battles however you want it. You don't have to come to the same conclusions that the actual battle or the actual war did.
So
That's true.
What I'm comparing here is like a Command and Color versus a Washington's War. Command and Colors, you're going to set up for a battle, and even if you play 3 or 4 of those in a row, yeah, you might be one side or another depending on the era or the time frame, and you might know something about them, but it doesn't matter at all.
So you're right.
The pieces you have on the board are the pieces you have. Washington's War, on the other hand, you're the British or the Americans, and you have very different rules based upon who you are and what you're doing, and it's about more than just the battle.
And your win conditions are probably different.
Yeah.
I'm going to use 2 things that you've led me to here. One is Command and Color series. That it is variable player powers. For instance, you will have, if you're playing the Carthaginians, you have light cavalry available to you that the Romans did not have. And that's going to change somewhat the way you play the game. Memoir 44, which is the same system essentially applied to World War II, there are various troops involved and a various mix of troops that are going to impact your strategy. I'm going to take the Washington's War and go to, and granted this is fantasy, but if you go to War of the Ring, which is the Lord of the Rings, so in the Lord of the Rings there's a larger war going on just than the events that you read in the book. You can find them in the appendix discussed if you're really into Lord of the Rings, although then you probably already know about them. But it talks about the war, And in that one, the winning conditions for the good guys are very different than the win conditions for the bad guys. And that's just kind of an extreme example because it's very, you have both variable player powers in the cards you play. Your action decks or event decks are not the same. And it's certainly asymmetric.
I'm having a hard time reconciling the idea of like variable player powers, such as Forbidden Island or Pandemic, as you said, where like you literally get a role or a character and you're that role or character the whole game and that determines what you do, versus this idea of like your deck giving you variable player powers, because that just feels like a deck. I don't know if there's a difference there, or right, because then we could get into deck builders and say, well, eventually they become variable player power games, but I'm not willing to go that far, you know?
That's why I said with Fleet Captains, I think that's the only deck one we brought up, right?
Yes, so far. Up to War of the Ring.
The two decks you're drafting from are completely different. Whereas
So
most deck builders, you're drafting from the same pool.
So when you crack them out of the box, it's two different.
You have a Federation deck and a Klingon deck. It's just which cards out of those you choose to use in the game.
So you have, in Fleet Captains, more specifically, you have 10 decks of 10 cards, and you're going to choose 4 of those to use, then shuffle those together as your main deck. Klingon's going to do the same thing. But there are of the 10 decks of 10 cards, the Federation ones are completely different than the Klingon ones. So you don't start the game same position. And part of, I think, the difference between something like a deck builder and variable player powers is how do you start the game? If you start the game with different powers, that's variable player powers. And in deck builders, Star Realms, Dominion, you start with the exact same hands.
So what about a game like Smash Up?
And I'll ruin that in a minute. Go ahead.
What about a game like Smash Up where, right, there's 30 different factions that you can choose from. So you can be like robot ninjas.
Right,
and you pick those at the start and you shuffle them into a deck. Is that variable player power? Because everybody has a different kind of theme and a different deck and a different army, if you will, to play the game with?
Right on the line, but I think I would say, yeah, it's variable player powers, because your strategy is not going to be the same from out of the gate.
Yeah, because it's out of the gate. If you were building that deck as you were going along, I would think it was more of a deck builder. That maybe led into some differences in the game of how the people play, but not necessarily because of the...
I mean, to say that it becomes variable player power as you build the game, we're going to go back to our old standby Monopoly. If you've bought Park Place and Boardwalk, and I've bought the railroads, are now we in a variable player power game? I don't think so.
Right.
I thought we were going to get through without Monopoly.
No, we can't get through without Monopoly. We have to have Monopoly in this.
We also have to bring up, if we're going to have a podcast, we got to bring up Dune.
Well, which is very definitely a variable player power game.
I think Dune incorporates variable player powers almost the best out of any of these games that I've played. For me, because... So if you're Atreides, your variable player powers are very much on theme with who Paul was in the books and what his powers were. And one of the reasons that I love the variable player powers in Dune so much is that it almost feels like you can't win without really engaging your faction and your characters. You can't win as Emperor without spending a lot of money. You can't
trying to soak everybody's money out of that.
Yeah, you can't win as the guild without manipulating people's movements and your own movements. You can't win as Atreides, not using all of Paul's powers that are available to you.
Right.
So within that game, you have to be your characters and your faction to be able to win that game. And not only does it affect what you're doing up front throughout the game, but the win conditions can be determined by your faction as well. And so I think the variable player powers are just so well woven into that game that you can't avoid it. You can't get around it, which might be a weakness for some people, but I think is a really great part of Dune.
So I think you bring up a point there, and that is, I'm not going to say every time, but very frequently, if you're going to have a game that's heavy in theme, you have to have variable player powers. Not always, but you look at Harry Potter game that you guys
Hogwarts Battles.
Yeah, Hogwarts Battles. We got Conan, Dune, every Star Wars game I've ever played. No, that's not true. There's a card game I have that I've played, and it's even, but it's fun, but it really doesn't feel that much like Star Wars.
Yeah.
So if you're gonna try and bring the theme alive, it seems like making variable player powers is a powerful way to do that. If not, it may not be the only way. Certainly, last time I talked about Dream Factory, and that felt very thematic, but you weren't taking on a role. It was definitely there were no variable player powers. It was symmetric. Go ahead, Brent.
Because it's not telling a story.
It's
And
not
it's
telling a
not
story.
based off telling a story.
That is true.
And I think that's the big thing is, yeah, essentially the games with variable player powers, you are taking on a character in a story. That story might only be for the duration of that game, like a Forbidden Island, but you are taking on a character in that story. And you're going to have to play to that.
Or at least a faction, right? I mean,
Yeah.
yes.
This is why I'd argue with you that the best variable player powers isn't Dune. It would be an RPG itself.
Well,
Where
that's
you are completely
true.
different characters.
That's true. And
Yeah,
that would-
I think I would agree. I think outside of RPG.
Okay.
So,
And I think,
so like leads you down the path of like something like Pathfinder, right? Where it's not an RPG, but it's RPG like, or Conan for that matter. You are, they are simulating in some sense RPGs.
and I think one of the reasons I love Dune so much is that the first time we played it, I'd never read the books and kind of just heard of it in passing. And after playing it the very first time, it led me to read the books and kind of fall in love with this whole world and this whole series. So the fact that, this board game was so thematic and so good for me that it led me actually to the literature it was based on. So for me, just that entire experience of playing this game and then being drawn into the books and drawn into the world was just such a cool experience. And I just think that the characters, and it makes the game complicated, right? That the factions are so thematic that there's so many like little points to them and so many
Yes.
powers, right? In Forbidden Island, your character pretty much just gives you one power. In Dune, it's like 12 of them listed throughout the game, and then there's like 3 win condition elements to be aware of throughout the game as well. So
Right.
it definitely makes it more complicated, but for me, it was just so rich that it really led me into kind of the whole world of Dune, which was cool.
I'll be interested to see how Game of Thrones plays out, since it is a story-type game, but there doesn't appear to be variable player powers except potentially the setup of each house.
That will be interesting.
Because that's, as I was sitting here
When you
thinking
say a
about it,
setup, you mean the physical locations they're set up on the board.
correct, the starting locations of the character. Beyond that, there's no special about any of the characters.
Does that one involve card play?
It does, and I know they have different decks, so that it might play
It
in
might
there.
be
I haven't
another
looked
one
at
of
those
those.
enough.
Yeah.
But
So I do think Shane brings up a point. Pretty much if you're going to have a variable player power game, you can figure that you're up in the notch of complexity. Not always, but, one of the things that makes Fury of Dracula complex is that it's got variable player powers for each of the hunters and for Dracula. That one's asymmetric and also in the fact that it's 4 against 1, but I know when I play the hunters, because you've got cards going on that impact your play and that are events and stuff like that, and that's not specific to a player. You're playing, well, each side has their own set of cards, but because of that, I frequently forget to even look at what's my character's powers. I get to carry extra stuff, I get to heal a little faster, or whatever they are, because I'm too busy playing my hand of cards that I forget that, I got these other things I can do too.
if we talk about how bad it is to be Mina, where you already are bitten, that's not a good power.
Yeah, no. Well, and to your point, you said in the intro, sometimes the variable player powers don't help.
Yeah.
They are variable player detriments.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to shout out another co-op game that I really like that uses this is Shadows over Camelot. I don't believe either of you have played this.
I have not.
No, you've talked about it once.
Yeah, so in Shadows over Camelot, you're playing one of the Knights of the Round Table, and you're fighting against the darkness, or, just kind of this general evilness in the game that's represented in different ways. And that also introduces a traitor mechanic, so one of the Knights can potentially be a traitor within the game and end up working for the darkness and going against all the other ones. But that's another one with variable player powers that I
Right.
really enjoyed. So another game that is a little bit different from all these that we've talked about, and I want to get your guys' take on, is Coup. So in Coup, everybody is assigned a character, but that character changes throughout the game. But what you can do is absolutely 100% determined by who you are in that round. So where does Coup fit into all of this?
It's not.
Why not?
I disagree.
You think it's a variable player power?
I think it is. And even though I've never managed to get the hang of that game at all,
Yeah, I don't care for it, personally.
I do think it is because he's right. The card you get is the personality you have at that moment. The fact that you're schizophrenic doesn't play into this, I guess. But it's the personality you have, and that affects how you play that round. It's just at a lower level. It's not going to be how you play, and potentially multiple rounds, but it's not going to be how you play the whole game necessarily, but it is going to be how you play.
So I would say it's not a variable player power game in that you have a starting set of cards, but it can be any cards, and you're drawing out of the same deck. To my mind, saying that is variable player power would be like saying, because I'm dealt a full house and not just a pair of threes in poker, makes it a variable player power game because it's going to impact my strategy. And I don't think that's the case.
It's not that it impacts strategy, it's that it determines strategy. I mean, you can't play a strategy with the character you get it if your character can't do that. So I'm trying to think of, so like the ambassador, right? In the ambassador, you can trade it in to get another card and get another identity. That strategy isn't available to you if you don't have the ambassador. You literally, that is a power defined by that character.
So let me ask this question, because it's been a long time since I've played Coup.
Sure.
If you have an ambassador card that allows you to do that, could I have an ambassador card that allows me to do it?
Potentially.
Then we could have two people who have the exact same position because they start with the same cards.
Potentially.
So I'm just really struggling with this.
So in variable player power, are we saying there can't be any crossover of powers? So to say if there's a game of 5 people, there can't be, you and I might have the same power, but we have different powers as well.
But in Coup, you wouldn't. If you had the exact same hand, you'd have the exact same powers.
Right.
So the interesting thing about Coup is that you could pretend to have any of the powers that you could have. It's if you get caught doing that.
Right.
That's the problem.
So Love Letter is somewhat similar, right? In that there are characters.
Are you serious? Every game's variable player power if we're going down this road.
Right, but there are specific characters in the game that define specific powers, and depending on the exact role that you have at a given moment, you have those specific powers.
That is not variable player powers.
I'm trying to work through this, and Frank is getting offended at me.
I'm not getting offended. I'm just saying.
I haven't even said like third cousin on your mom's side.
Wow.
4 times removed yet. I haven't even gotten to that conversation.
I wouldn't even go there either.
No, see, I think at very least it is a related category because each of the cards has a given power.
So what is that mechanic?
So let me ask this. It's just card play. You have cards with variable powers associated with the cards.
Variable card powers, then.
Wow.
I mean, that's what you said.
So, in a variable player power game, I take on a role. That role comes with specific powers. Typically, it's a named role, right? In Coup, you're just shuffling the cards and dealing them out. I don't have, by virtue of the fact that I picked this faction, this set of variable player powers that is unique to me throughout the game. But variable player powers typically
So you're saying they last the game? The whole game?
Yeah, I would say they last the game.
Okay.
But I think something like a Coup and a Love Letter go beyond a normal card play because they have the cards aren't sequential, they aren't any kind of normal order. They have their own individual characteristics.
So then Dominion's a variable player power game. Because each kingdom card has its own set of characteristics.
But we call that a deck builder, whereas Coup and Love Letter aren't.
So, by virtue of the fact that it doesn't fit in any other category, it's a variable player power game.
But no, I'm willing to say it's not actually a full player power. I'm just saying it is somewhat related in that if you're trying to categorize that one, It's going to fall out somewhere around those.
Yeah, I think...
No. But if you
again, I think we're somewhat falling into the trap of saying, is this a variable player power game versus does it utilize that type of mechanic?
So let's take an entirely different approach to this.
All right, let's do it.
And that is, if you were walking up to somebody and describing a game, would you walk up to somebody who's never played Coup and say, hey, let's play this game. It's a variable player power game.
Well,
is that the way you would describe it?
Well, I wouldn't walk up to a stranger and use...
You know what I mean.
language,
I didn't say stranger.
But...
You walk up to strangers and say things all the time, but that's part of your job.
I wouldn't say that, but I think we have to recognize that there is a similar element. Let's not say it's the same, but because so you want to define this as lasting the whole game, which is great. I totally get that. I think that's the biggest strength of variable player power games is this idea that you take on this role, this character, this faction, and you play them the entire game. It shapes that entire experience when you're sitting at the table. I don't want to take away from that because I think that is the big strength of this mechanic in these type of games. But I think at any given moment, so if you take a snapshot of a game of Coup, a game of Love Letter, any of these types of games, I think in that snapshot, in that moment, each individual person is a character, is defined by what their character can do within that moment. So I think there's some relationship, but at the end of the day, I definitely see where you're coming from. I think it has to last the whole game, and I really do think that that's the power of variable player power games.
But yes, if I walk up to someone with Love Letter, the first thing I tell them is, you have all these cards, and they have different roles and abilities.
The cards have different roles and abilities, not the players.
But that is the first thing I tell them.
Okay,
so I think...
So let's go one real quick around because we're running out of time.
Okay.
So you've got a friend who's been playing games. We all have friends who come over and they play games with us, but they're not going to show up at our gaming group. They're not going to really get into this. They're just kind of casual players. What's your pick to introduce them to this? Shane.
So for a casual player, I would just pick up Forbidden Island. It's such a quick play. It's co-op, so it's pretty enjoyable for everybody. I think there are better variable player power games, but if I just had to pull one out real quick to throw on the table and play, it'd be Forbidden Island.
Probably Hogwarts Battle, because I think it has enough elements to lead them into further different mechanics as well. So they get not only a feel of variable player power, but if they continue playing the game because they like it, they get other things as well.
Yeah, so I made you guys go first because I have no idea what I would pick. And part of the problem with that is once I start looking at my favorite ones, they're heavier than I would introduce to a casual player. I would probably go with Pandemic, which is again by the same designer as Forbidden Island. I personally don't care for Forbidden Island. That I think it's a little too easy to win, but that's more characteristic of how it plays as a co-op game. That's really not part of the variable player power parts of it. So hope you enjoyed this episode. We hope that you come back and listen again and bring other people with you. Have a great week.
Hey everyone, thanks for listening. This is just a reminder that we are completing Season 2 and are ready to take our break throughout the month of April. We haven't decided what we will be doing in Season 3, but we hope you'll listen. If you do have ideas, feel free to email us or contact us through our Facebook page. In the meantime, we will see you in May. Thanks.
This has been the Analog Gamers Podcast. Thanks for listening. Please spread the word about our podcast, which can be found at theanaloggamers.libsyn.com. You can email us at theanaloggamers@gmail.com or find us on Facebook as The Analog Gamers. Our intro and outro are recorded by Daniel Feldman. Logo artwork provided by Tabitha Jordan Nichols. The Analog Gamers Podcast is licensed under Attribution, No Commercial, Non-Derivative, Creative Commons 4.0 license.